When you ask somebody who is their favorite slasher, what do they usually say? Freddy, Jason, Michael, Chucky. But what about Candyman? For a long time, one of them really stood out. Tony Todd's performance of the character Daniel Robitaille, referred to as the Candyman, was the blackest face in horror. The character itself is a bit of a controversial one, even maligned temporarily by the NAACP, but for many people, this character is their favorite of all time. In a genre like horror, which is so popular with black audiences but has so few prominent black characters, Tony Todd stood above them. Somewhat literally, because he was like 6'7", but yes. Tony Todd himself was a beloved figure in black media, particularly black genre media. He's in episodes of The X Files. He's in Star Trek. He played the literal personification of death in the Final Destination movies. He was in The Crow. He's the voice of Venom. And he filled the large, illustrious shoes of Ben in the Night of the Living Dead remake. Tony was a versatile actor. He also performed on Broadway in August Wilson plays and was a fixture of the horror convention circuit. He is the definition of an underrated, classically trained actor, but isn't as well celebrated, I think, as he should have been.
So, but I wanted to ask about how do you feel about being part of that legacy of having Candyman in that for so long?
You know, I love Candyman. I love Night of the Living Dead, but I did not train to become a horror actor. But I have no shame about it. It's just the luck of the draw. But that's why I constantly fight to tell people I don't want to be pigeonholed like that. And I don't want to be that black guy that does horror films. I do a lot of films. Okay. And I'm not bragging. I do. I do a lot of films, I do a lot of different things. But people like what they like. So that's all I can say. And whenever they get too close or it gets too unnerving, I return running to theater.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it is something that sort of hit the zeitgeist with everybody, and upon its first initial release, it did kind of have some criticism to it,
No, do
uh,
it.
and now though with the 2020 release of this movie coming out, the way in which people are so excited for this film. We talked earlier about the new trailer that just
Yeah.
dropped.
Wasn't that amazing?
So good. Oh,
So very, very good. Esoteric, feminine, elegant, artistic, beautiful.
you're so right about that. So it's so feminine and so elegant and graceful in this sort of quiet, small sort of a way, that's so effective. You're right about that.
I did hear some comments, so some, you know, Twitter noise
Mm.
about whether or not Candyman was appropriate for the woke generation or people that did never got that Candyman was about race in the first place. I don't know how that was missed, but it's very much about race and
So
about condition.
I mean, how do you feel about that? I mean, how do you feel about um, this sort of new embracing of, well, I guess not new because it's been happening this whole entire time, but that Candyman has become such a cultural figure, and that we're having so many different kinds of conversations. I don't know how you could miss the messaging and the way in which Candyman sort of goes through the horrors of slavery and how that reverberates into the present day. I don't know how you could miss that, but that's another thing.
There were some scenes that were cut out of the original that
Mm.
further explain Helen and I's relationship and the depth of it, but the studio was a little nervous and they didn't want us too intimate.
That's interesting because the intimacy, the sort of romance of your character,
It was there anyway, but it was really, really there before
yeah.
scissors came in.
Because I think of Candyman as sort of a figure like Dracula, like the Phantom of the Opera.
Very much like the Phantom. Yeah.
Yeah, a gothic.
And we got to give props, Yes, Clive Barker wrote The Forbidden, which this is based, but his version was a hideous, hairy, googly-eyed, you know. Um, Bernard Rose, who's a dear friend of mine, had the genius to transpose this story into Chicago. And I'll never forget, we were hanging out in the Kingston Mines, one of my favorite blues bars in Chicago on the north side. Shout out to Frank Pellegrino. And he kept wanting to talk about Candyman, and and Buddy Guy was playing, and I wanted to hear Buddy, and he kept twisting his hair and saying, "No, this is gonna be terrific. It's gonna be wonderful and stuff." And we've been friends since that day. And the chance we get to work together, we do.
When I say that he isn't as celebrated, right, you think of him as being this really huge icon that was really beloved by everybody, but he didn't really win a lot of major awards. He was often overlooked, even though he was so versatile and he had such an amazing voice and such an amazing character. And if I have to be honest, I do think it's because he was in a bunch of horror movies, and horror movies aren't really that well respected in the industry. But I will say that Candyman is probably one of the best, most beloved film roles that I have ever seen. It's an iconic role, one of those roles that you see and lives on in pop culture media for decades and decades and decades. And so when the 2021 version came up, it was a really interesting kind of dynamic to see the original film next to the 2021 film. I know that there are sequels in between those two films, but please, we're not going to discuss those, not right now.
Don't say that.
The two films are really in conversation with each other. The second film picking up kind of sort of right after the first film. It's a spiritual sequel, meaning that even though it's not the literal sequel, the films should be watched back to back in sequence. You can watch both of these films in sequence. Both of these films take a look at the socio-racial political world in which they were made. They say a lot about the time period in which they were made in, and also about the systems and the impact in culture in which both of these films were made. So for the sake of the video, I'll be discussing 1992 and 2021's version of Candyman and comparing them together. In Bernard Rowe's 1992 version of Candyman, Helen Lyle is a semiotics graduate student researching urban legends in Chicago. Her investigation leads her to Cabrini Green, a housing project plagued by stories of a killer ghost summoned by saying his name 5 times in a mirror. Helen's curiosity and also her privilege takes her deep into Cabrini Green and meets residents including Anne-Marie McCoy, who is raising her infant son Anthony, and a young boy named Jake. Jake acts as Helen's child ghetto guide throughout the entire film, which where are Jake's parents? Who does this child belong to? He even shows up at the end alone with no parents. Anyway, after Helen is attacked by a local gang leader who has been pinned as being the Candyman and responsible for the murders that happen, it's believed that the legend is resolved. Everything is just an urban legend. But Candyman comes to her. He tells her that because of her work to discredit his legend, he needs to commit another murder. Helen wakes up in Anne-Marie's apartment covered in blood. And after a fight with Anne-Marie and injuring her, Helen finds out that baby Anthony is missing. After the death of her friend Bernadette, Helen is put in a psychiatric facility, not a jail, even though they think that she might have been killing people, including her best friend and a baby. But just put a pin in that one. She finally calls out, she does the ritual, and says his name 5 times. Candyman comes to her, frees her, and she escapes back to Cabrini Green. There she finds Candyman has the baby Anthony. He tells her that to strengthen his legend, he must continue to spill innocent blood and needs Helen's help to do it. He tells Helen that if she agrees to do it, he'll spare baby Anthony's life. But Candyman reneges on the deal and wants to incinerate Helen, baby Anthony, and himself in this community bonfire that happens. Helen stabs him with a wooden plank, which kills him, which is also interesting, seeing as he's dead and a ghost, and like I would think is like impervious to wood, but like regardless, and saves the baby Anthony. In turn, Helen dies and becomes a local legend herself. The lore of Candyman is rooted actually in a real-life tragedy. On the evening of April 22nd, 1987, a woman heard a disturbance coming from inside of her walls. She called 911 and waited for the police to come and help her. The noises coming from her bathroom wall were now coming from her bathroom mirror. Her name was Ruthie Mae McCoy, and she was a 52-year-old woman living in the ABLA housing project of Chicago. Then, after waiting and waiting, 2 more calls to the police were made. Ruthie Mae was reportedly a woman who struggled with her mental health and was trying to get her GED degree. She lived in one of Chicago's most dangerous housing projects, which the police knew, and it did not help her mental health struggles. It was known that she thought that people were trying to kill her, which, unfortunately, she was right about this time. The police arrived at 9:10, about 25 minutes after her initial call. They were unable to gain entry to her home after the key that they were provided with didn't work, so they left. The police then returned the next day after a neighbor called concerned about McCoy's lack of presence. The police knocked on the door, and it went unanswered, and they refused to break down the door for fear of property damage. It wasn't until the day after that a housing authority official arrived with a carpenter who drilled through the lock on McCoy's door, and that was when she was found, shot 4 times in her home. In the bathroom, a hole was in the wall where the mirror was, revealing a hidden gap between apartments that allowed 2 men to get in and kill and rob Ruthie Mae McCoy. Her death was a tragedy, not only due to the fact that the 2 men, Ted Turner and John Honduras, who killed her, served absolutely no time for their crimes due to lack of evidence, but also because Ruthie's murder highlighted systemic failures, racism, neglect, and the way that poverty traps people in unsafe conditions. It's a grim reminder that urban legends, like Candyman, often spring from real fears and systemic injustices. So it's here that the real-life world of Ruthie Mae McCoy enters in the world of urban legends, and the fear of having someone climb into your walls to kill you kind of was born. But Miss McCoy's murder speaks much more than just a case of crime. It's about a failure of the state, a failure to protect you, the way that poverty is a trap for people, a trap that it's hard to get out of. She might have been saved had the police taken her seriously, if they protected everyone fairly, if she lived somewhere else, or maybe if she wasn't a black woman at all. There are many, many cases of the police failing to protect, of people calling for help and that help going unanswered. And the truth is that it could happen to anyone. Urban legends operate as warnings of the dangers that come from inner city life. They work in the same way as like fairy tales or horror movies do. They help us to recognize scary situations. Everyone has heard a story that happened to someone's cousin or someone's cousin's friend or someone's cousin's friend's neighbor, and it all feels completely true. Sometimes more than other times, but yeah. We believe it because it feels like if we know that there are razor blades in our Halloween candy or murderers in our walls or alligators in our sewers, we can protect ourselves. It gives us a feeling of security or like a feeling that we have control over our situation. We can be mindful and never be a victim. But we're all potential victims. We can all be failed by our institutions at any time and those that we thought were sworn to protect us. There is no difference between Ruthie Mae McCoy and any of us. Cabrini Green was a very real place. Built in 1942, it originally had 586 units in 54 buildings and was occupied by about 75% white people and around 25% black tenants. These were lower income homes, built specifically for lower income people, initially occupied by mostly Italians and Irish Americans, and was located to a nearby gas refinery that would shoot fire up into the air, which likened the area to kind of a pit of hell. But when white flight began, it impacted the Cabrini Green area as well. White people experienced upward mobility and moved into the suburbs during a time when Irish and Italian Americans became folded into whiteness, leaving black people behind. Cabrini Green slipped into more and more neglect from the city. Gangs had always been a problem in that area, but once the economic impacts ravaged the area, it became even worse. Because the occupants of Cabrini Green were of low income, the taxes coming from that area to maintain it was also low. The projects were known for their poorly maintained grounds, defunct elevators, peeling paint, and crumbling infrastructure. At its peak, it was home to over 15,000 people: men, women, families, elderly people, veterans, people with disabilities, babies, all crammed into one space, left behind by the wealth and success just across the river to them in Chicago. Cabrini Green is a perfect location for this kind of story. It's one of the only films that uses a housing project as a type of haunted house. It's a crumbling marker of America's unkempt promises and also deeply racist past, complete with its own roving phantom prowling the grounds, haunting the inhabitants of Cabrini Green. In 2011, the last building of Cabrini Green was demolished. And if you go there today, you probably wouldn't even recognize it. The area is prime real estate. It has great views of Chicago. And after the last of the black residents were moved out, the land is now being turned into luxury condos and mixed-use living, aka it's being gentrified. The character of Candyman is a tragic one. He was lynched for being sexually attracted to a white woman, something that has been repeated in American history many times. And the result of his torture and death is a spirit that doesn't want to be forgotten. Candyman is a reminder of America's horrific past that haunts Black Americans and that white Americans try to forget. We're often the only keepers of this history, white Americans having the luxury to be able to forget, able to put space between themselves and the horrific past, but not us. We're often still victims of that history, repeated over and over and over and over again. It takes a toll on our minds, on our bodies, and on what we think of as our legacies. Candyman's initial release was largely successful, making about $25.8 million on an $8 to $9 million budget, which is pretty good. It has largely positive scores on Rotten Tomatoes, which, you can take with a grain of salt. But the film was not without its own detractors. There's no question that this film plays on white middle-class fears of Black people, director Carl Franklin said back in 1992. It unabashedly uses racial stereotypes and destructive myths to create shock. I found it hokey and unsettling. It didn't work for me because I don't share those fears, buy into those myths. Which, honestly, is a fair critique. The movie came out in 1992. We're in the thick of Reagan-era policies. All of the anti-Blackness and all of the welfare queens of it all. And also between that and Clinton-era super predators. There's this idea that's prevalent among white people even today that Black people are inherently more dangerous. And there was a fear that putting Candyman, a Black killer, on the big screen would only fuel those fears and put Black people's lives in danger. The irony is that Candyman is kind of a beloved figure. It's a very largely successful film and is watched annually, if not monthly, by millions of people all over the country and all over the world. Like I've said before, though, Candyman is one of the only major black horror icons. Hopefully not for too much long, especially if Jordan Peele has anything to do with it. But the impact is huge. It was huge on horror, and it was huge on pop culture, and even to this day, saying Candyman in a mirror is a beloved activity of sleepovers with people all over the country. However, I will say this, okay? Having a black horror icon who preys on black people never really felt right to me. It's one of the main complaints that people have about this movie, which I also think is pretty fair. An oversight from the filmmakers, despite their repeated meetings with the NAACP, which leads us to the next film. Fast forward to 2021, and Nia DaCosta releases her version of Candyman. We see the return of Anthony McCoy, now an adult, to the Cabrini Green projects, which are being gentrified into condos. Anthony is a living artist in Chicago and is looking for inspiration. He encounters a local laundromat owner, William, who tells them the legend of Sherman Fields, also known as the Candyman. He was a disabled black homeless man who had a hook for a hand, and he would often gift kids candy. And after a child died from a razor blade in a piece of candy, Sherman was implicated. He was then pursued by police and beaten to death. Anthony is told that if he says Candyman 5 times in the mirror, he will summon Sherman. Anthony is inspired by this story, and when he makes a piece about it and displays it in a gallery, it is disparaged by white art critics. Several others are killed in the meantime, and Anthony begins painting the faces of black men that he does not recognize in a sort of fugue state. He confronts his mother, who tells him that he was involved in the Candyman murders from the first movie, and that he should leave that alone. Anthony's girlfriend, Brianna, seeks more information from William, who reveals that he also has a connection to Candyman. When he was a boy, he witnessed the murder of Sherman Fields in front of his own eyes, and he understands that black men join a sort of hive of Candyman once they are unjustly killed, growing the urban legends, and William also has plans to make Anthony one of the hive. The police are called, who gun down Anthony. Then they try to intimidate Brianna into saying that the slaying was justified. She summons Candyman in the rearview mirror of the car, and he kills the police officers. Anthony is then transformed into Daniel Robitaille and demands that she tells everyone what she saw, thus keeping the legend alive. DaCosta's Candyman shifts the focus from individual terror to systemic injustice and terror. It's not just about one man's lynching, it's about the cycles of violence that plague black communities over and over again, from police brutality to gentrification. In 2012, 17-year-old Trayvon Martin was killed in the street by George Zimmerman for being suspected of being a burglar. In 2012, 22-year-old Rakia Boyd was killed by an off-duty cop when he fired into a group of her friends. In 2014, Michael Brown was killed by police in Ferguson, Missouri for suspicion of theft. In 2014, Eric Garner was killed by police, also on suspicion. In 2014, 12-year-old Tamar Rice was killed by police for playing with a toy gun in his neighborhood. In 2015, Eric Harris was killed by a police officer in Tulsa, Oklahoma, when the police officer mistook his taser for a gun. In 2015, Freddie Gray Jr. was killed by the Baltimore police for running away. In 2017, Seattle police killed mother of 4, Charlene Lyles, in front of her children when she called them because she thought she was being burglarized. In 2018, Elijah McClain was killed by police after being injected with an overdose of ketamine, also on a suspicion. In 2020, 26-year-old Breonna Taylor was killed in her sleep by police gunfire. George Floyd was killed after police officer Derek Chauvin kneeled on his neck until he stopped breathing. And these are just the ones that we know. These are just the ones that made it to mainstream news. This is not a comprehensive list of every single killing. These are just the popular ones, just the famous ones. There are hundreds more every single year. The killing, the slaughter of black people by police is nothing new. and it hasn't stopped. In 2021, the film picks up the narrative threads of the first movie and expands on them. The movie goes into those cycles of violence that perpetuate Black communities that was sort of only kind of hinted at in the first movie, and really examines them. It examines the ways in which being subjected to witnessing violence makes a mark on people. Often we don't discuss what it does to a person to ingest the constant killing of people, of witnessing brutality, poverty, depression, neglect, racism, and classism your entire life. The original film focused on Helen's personal journey and discovery, while the sequel is more of a collective story, showing how trauma is passed down and shared amongst communities. The movie shines a light on structural violence that we often don't focus on. In America, it's much more likely to focus on the sensationalism of like crime dramas, gang violence, drugs, sex work, but we rarely trace the roots of those things back to their root causes, which is structural violence. The term structural violence was coined by sociologist Johann Galtung in 1969 and is defined as being avoidable impairment of fundamental human needs. And examples of this are gender discrimination, racial discrimination, police brutality, and state violence. He describes it in contrast to what we call classical violence, which, is violence, punching, hitting, slapping, those kinds of things. It contrasts that to what we call structural violence as violence that is not committed by one actor and has no beginning to it. Violence that results in harm to the mind and the psyche. Even though you didn't suffer from any kind of like bruises, cuts, or anything like that, it means that the violence is lasting in your psyche. It has long-term effects to your mind and your identity and how you see the world and how you see yourself. Anthony is a product of the cycles of violence that happened to Black people, an inheritance that he was born into. He channels that pain and art into consumption for largely white audiences. There are rare opportunities for Black people to channel their trauma. Instead, it's usually manifested in violence, either violence pointed towards others or violence pointed towards yourself. And it spreads, well, like a thick honey over everything. It's hard to walk through, to see through, to get through. And this movie really kind of shines a light on all of that. Anthony is a victim of structural racism, the same as Daniel, in his community, which is now being turned into luxury condos. Which is interesting because gentrification is also a form of violence. Displacing people from their homes is also a form of violence. His past is haunting him, and he has nowhere to go, as many Black men have nowhere to turn except for the women in his life. Brianna, though, is dealing with her own trauma. As a girl, she saw her father succumb to mental health issues and take his life in front of her eyes. She's kind of a stand-in for all the Black women in society who are left behind. As Black men die from police brutality, incarceration, drug abuse, and mental health episodes, Black women are left behind with nothing but their PTSD and their memories. It was over 2 decades since the first movie, and so much had changed in the meantime, especially in the cultural discourse and the way that we talk about horror movies. It would be bizarre and tone-deaf to have a film about a Black man who was lynched by a racist mob and not bring up the current events that are going on. In the original Candyman, the film uses the projects as a haunted house. But what happens when a haunted house is torn down? And what if that haunted house that's torn down happens to have new upwardly mobile white entrepreneurs and startup tech entrepreneurs moving into it? The haunting can no longer be contained. It spreads, and it's no longer just a burden for the Black community. It becomes everyone's problem, America's problem. Much like what has happened in America, with discovering the truth of racial discrimination through our own mirrors, our own black mirrors, our phones, what used to be a fear in urban communities is now everywhere. Every town across America, including white communities, know about the rot and the systemic dysfunction of racism. In Candyman 1992, the experience is singular. It is the story of one woman, Helen, and her discovering the violence of one community, where Candyman 2021 shows us that violence affects the collective. It's shared amongst all of us, from mother to son, father to daughter, neighbor to neighbor. There's no singular experience of violence in a community. Its victims are as many as there are bees in a hive. Candyman 2021 expands on the idea that there's only one Candyman and reveals that there are actually many. Every community has a story of a shocking and sickening horror. There was Daniel, there was Sherman Fields, there's William, there's Anthony, and on and on and on and on. These men are all a part of the legend. People who were victims of unjust violence and whose deaths stained their communities forever, marked the lives of many people. A haunting that lives inside the mind, inside the heart, inside what is the history of America. And it can be said that all black people in America are haunted to a certain degree. We live with the ghost of our past. We're forever existing in the shadow of a great sin that was committed against us and whose echoes reverberate in the facet of our lives. We're unable to shake the haunting because it's not as simple as leaving the house, because the house is a country. So all we can do is tell our stories. No matter how brutal, terrifying, sickening, or horrific, we have to tell our stories. Tell what happened to us and never let them forget. So what's your impression of these movies? And I would love to know what you think of the 1992 version versus the 2021 version. I personally really love both of them, and I think that they make great double features if you can handle that in one night. Thank you so much for watching. I also want to say thank you so much for watching the last video. It did really, really well. And there were so many of you who watched that video, and you guys said like the nicest stuff. You guys are incredible. You guys have such thoughtful, amazing things to say, and I'm so happy that I get to build this community with you. I cannot wait to see what kind of things we make. If you like this, please hit a like and subscribe. You can find more information about what I'm working on my website, isabellavonghoul.com, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one. Be kind to yourself, take care of other people, because the monsters are always closer than you think. Okay, bye! Bye!
They will say that I have shed innocent blood. What's blood for, if not for shedding? With my hook for a hand, I'll split you from your groin to your gullet.